So, my plans for the past week got kind of derailed, and so I'm going to have to be catching up over the next week. But in the meantime, I watched the Fallout television series, so let's go ahead and talk about that. Obviously, I have some thoughts on it just purely as a television show completely detached from the Fallout franchise, and I have much more strong thoughts about it as a piece of Fallout media. I'm also going to talk a bit about the discourse that has been surrounding the show, as well as what all of this means for the Fallout franchise going forward. So let's just go ahead and start with my thoughts about it purely as a television show completely detached from the Fallout franchise. As a television show, I was actually very pleasantly surprised with it. It has good production values, the set and costume design is actually pretty solid. There's actually quite a lot of practical effects, and they look pretty good, and as a general rule, the acting is actually pretty solid. It's not award-winning performances, but it's all solid enough to where it was a perfectly watchable TV series. The problem is that it is completely impossible to detach it from the Fallout franchise. And as a piece of Fallout media, this completely crosses the line. You see, for those of you who have only played the games since Bethesda started making them, or those of you who are very new to the franchise in general, you need to understand a few things. The original Fallout was developed by Interplay Productions as a sort of spiritual successor to the 1988 game Wasteland, which they had lost the rights to because EA owned the rights to that by that point. And so, Interplay's development team took some of the ideas from Wasteland, post-apocalyptic, sense of humor, the gratuitous violence, things like that, and implemented them in their new game, Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game which released in 1997. And what do you know? The original Fallout was a big success, it was very well received, and it has gone on to become considered one of the best games ever made. Not just one of the best RPGs ever made, one of the best games across all genres ever made. Obviously, with the success of the original, they ended up making a sequel. This time it would be developed by Interplay's sub-studio called Black Isle Studios. The sequel released in 1998, and it was also a major success, very well received across the board, and has also become considered one of the best games ever made, not just one of the best role-playing games ever made. Black Isle would go on to further success with the release of Planescape Torment the following year, another of those best games ever made across any genre, not just one of the best role-playing games ever made, although in this particular case it's arguably the best role-playing game ever made. And they would also develop Icewind Dale along with its expansion pack Heart of Winter and Icewind Dale 2, and they would publish a few games you might have heard of called Baldur's Gate, Baldur's Gate Tales of the Sword Coast, Baldur's Gate 2 Shadows of Am, and Baldur's Gate 2 Throne of Baal. In case you can't tell by this point, Black Isle Studios is a name that is legendary among role-playing game fans, for very good reason. Now, they weren't the only ones working on Fallout games at this point. Interplay did outsource development of a game that would become known as Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel, these days usually just shortened to Fallout Tactics because of another game called Brotherhood of Steel, and while that game was outsourced to an Australian company, they actually did a really good job with it. It was a successful game commercially, and it was pretty well received overall, although its canonicity to the Fallout franchise as a whole was up for debate until pretty recently. So in the scope of only a few years, Fallout had already cemented itself as a major franchise among especially role-playing games, but just gaming in general. And unfortunately, the company that owned it, Interplay Productions, was running into pretty severe financial problems. And as part of this whole mess, they ended up laying off the entire development staff at Black Isle Studios and canceling all of the projects they had currently in development. This included the original Baldur's Gate 3, as well as a game they codenamed Van Buren, which would have been Fallout 3. After being laid off from Black Isle, a lot of the development staff from Black Isle would go on to form Obsidian Entertainment, which exists to this day, with a few other key members of the development team going on to form Troika Games, and ending up making my favorite role-playing game of all time, which is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. It's the game that actually cemented my love of role-playing games. As well as Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, which is also fantastic, and The Temple of Elemental Evil, a classic Greyhawk adventure, which is also really good, although it's not quite as good as the other two games they made. And Interplay would have one final Fallout game under their umbrella. It was the console-exclusive Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, which is, again, the reason why Fallout Tactics is usually just referred to as Fallout Tactics rather than its full title, because otherwise you might confuse the two. And you don't want to confuse the two, because Fallout Tactics is actually a rather solid game, and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel is not. And that's putting it lightly. So as you might expect from the game just frankly being awful, it ended up being a flop, and Interplay ended up selling the franchise to Bethesda Softworks, who started work on their version of Fallout 3, which released in 2008 and marks a major schism in not only the Fallout fan base, but just the Fallout franchise in general. You see, here's the thing about Bethesda Fallout that a lot of people don't really seem to understand. Bethesda's interpretation of Fallout never goes beyond the most surface-level stuff you can imagine. The only thing they ever really saw with it was brand recognition. They only saw things like the series' dark humor, a post-apocalyptic setting, power armor and other high technology like lasers and plasma weapons and things like that, mutants and the retro-futuristic aesthetic, and thought, we can make a really fun game out of that. And by going that route, they failed to recognize what actually made Fallout 1 and 2 successful. It was not all these very surface-level things. It was not only the iconography of the franchise that made it successful. That helped, sure, but it was primarily the strength of the game's writing, both in terms of story, characters, and setting, as well as their game design. And one of the key elements that Bethesda missed when they started work on Fallout 3 was that the wasteland of Fallout 1 and especially 2 is not post-apocalyptic. It is post-apocalyptic. Because you have to remember, these games take place about a century after the Great War. The immediate aftermath of all of that would have been the post-apocalypse, and in the century or so hence, society has started to rebuild itself. And as of Fallout 2, which takes place about 80 years after the events of the first game, there are now full-on nation-states again encompassing large swaths of territory and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of citizens. And between large-scale agriculture, including ranching, people aren't really worried about subsistence survival anymore. People are back to working 9-to-5 jobs. There are factories again. There are buildings being constructed from the ground up, as opposed to just being thrown together ramshackle with whatever random scrap people can find. And public utilities like water and electricity have been reestablished. Again, it's not a post-apocalyptic wasteland. It is a post-apocalyptic wasteland. In the outlying areas beyond the realm of civilization, obviously there's still an irradiated wasteland full of danger, but civilization is gradually reclaiming all of that. That is the world of Fallout 1 and especially Fallout 2. And yet, when you get to Fallout 3, which is set 36 years after the events of Fallout 2, and 200 years after the Great War, when you step out into the wasteland, it's like the Great War just ended. It is a post-apocalyptic wasteland, not a post-apocalyptic wasteland like it should have been. So right off the bat, Fallout 3 feels very wrong if you're familiar with Fallout 1 and 2, and that wrongness only continues to intensify the further you get in. Lore consistencies just continually pile up because it's abundantly clear Bethesda really didn't care much about keeping things consistent, and the moral ambiguity present in Fallout 1 and 2 is just completely absent in Fallout 3. Everything just gets reduced down to either being a cartoonish villain or a goody two-shoes, and there's really nothing in between. Then, of course, there's the whole mess of the Brotherhood of Steel being depicted as knights in gleaming power armor out to save the wasteland, and their main antagonist is the Enclave, which is a leftover from Fallout 2 and is really only used because it's abundantly clear that Bethesda really, really likes power armor. And if you have a faction that is known for wearing power armor like the Brotherhood of Steel, then obviously the main antagonist for them needs to be another faction that's known for wearing power armor, and the only other faction that fits the bill at the time they were developing Fallout 3 is the Enclave, even though the Enclave was destroyed at the end of Fallout 2. So the writing in Fallout 3 was an absolute mess, full of holes and full of retcons, and from a Fallout 1 and 2 fan standpoint, it was just all kinds of wrong. And then when you moved over to the gameplay design, It was basically a really clunky first-person shooter, where the solution to most things was just go into this thing that is totally not a dungeon and clear out everything in it. It really just ended up being a Fallout game in name and imagery only, and for people who enjoyed that game, apparently that was enough, because it brought a whole new element of the fanbase in. This means that as of Fallout 3, you have a schism in the fanbase. You have fans of classic Fallout 1 and 2, and to some degree Tactics, and you have fans of Fallout 3 specifically, nearly all of whom had absolutely no idea about the Fallout franchise until Fallout 3 came out, and they don't care about Fallout 1 and 2 because those games are old and boring. So now we have a problem brewing in the fan base, but Bethesda is like, hey, this game is really successful. We need to make a follow-up to it, but we're working on other things right now. At this point, they're working on Skyrim mainly, so they outsourced development of a follow-up to Fallout 3 to Obsidian Entertainment, aka the studio full of people who worked on Fallout 1, but especially Fallout 2, and knew exactly what to do with the Fallout franchise, and knew exactly what made it good in the first place. I remember the Fallout 3 that they were working on, codenamed Van Buren. Well, guess what? They took a lot of the ideas from that and implemented them into their new Fallout game, which became known as Fallout New Vegas. And much like with Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas was very successful, both critically and commercially. And that was despite it having a massive amount of technical problems. So now you had a game that Fallout 1 and 2 fans were thoroughly enjoying because it was a continuation of classic Fallout. But what about those fans of Fallout 3 who only came into the series with that one? Well, then you have a further schism in the fan base, because now you have people who enjoyed Fallout 3 who went on to play New Vegas and actually really enjoyed that and woke up to what a Fallout game actually should be, versus fans of Fallout 3 who went on to play New Vegas and found it really boring. This means that going into the next major Fallout game, you have a very significant divide in the fan base, and that would ultimately come to a head when Bethesda released Fallout 4 in 2015, and it missed the point of Fallout even more. It retconned even more, and it turned the series even more into just a first-person shooter. And on top of that, even the goody two-shoes versus cartoonish villainy that you had in Fallout 3 has been even further reduced into, you're either a goody two-shoes, or you're just a bit of a jerk. Now, Fallout 4 was, of course, a huge success, as all Bethesda games tend to be at this point, and the fan base has firmly settled into two camps. You have classic Fallout fans, so fans of 1, 2, and New Vegas, and you have Bethesda Fallout fans, fans of Fallout 3, 4, and eventually 76. And it is abundantly clear that these two fan bases want very different things out of the Fallout franchise. Fans of classic Fallout want the actual role-playing that those games provided. They want the lore, they want the setting, all of the stuff that was presented in Fallout 1 and 2 and then continued into New Vegas. Fans of Bethesda Fallout, on the other hand, just want a post-apocalyptic theme park. And that presents a bit of a problem for Bethesda, because not only is Bethesda unwilling to deliver the former, but they're also incapable of doing so. They haven't been capable of doing that kind of thing since, at the very least, the very early 2000s. The last time we saw them do something even remotely close to that was Morrowind back in 2002. The theme park design, though, that's exactly what they've been delivering ever since Oblivion. The problem is, they've also been getting worse and worse at delivering that experience ever since Oblivion. Each subsequent game just continues to get worse in technical problems. The engine falls apart more and more. The actual writing suffers severely. The game design gets increasingly dumbed down. And with each subsequent release, they're losing more and more of their fan base as people continue to find that the games just aren't as good as they used to be, and finally we get to the point where we get to Fallout 76, and the game is a complete disaster. And while eventually they would patch it to the point where it's basically a much crappier Fallout 4, it's still a much crappier Fallout 4, and eventually they would come out with Starfield, which is such a mess even Bethesda fans really aren't willing to defend it. So prior to the release of the Fallout TV series, we find ourselves in a situation where Bethesda's quality is continually declining, and there are two deeply entrenched camps of Fallout fans. You have fans of classic Fallout, and you have fans of Bethesda's theme park approach. Neither of these fan bases really get along well at all, but there is a sort of unspoken agreement that is observed by all sides of this, which is, as long as there is a degree of separation between classic Fallout and Bethesda Fallout, it's not necessarily good, but it's at least tolerable. In other words, let classic Fallout fans have the western part of the US because that's where all of the classic Fallout stuff takes place in. Whereas Bethesda can have the eastern part of the US and do whatever the hell they want with it. That's fine. Have this degree of separation and we can at least kind of get along. And this is where the TV show comes in, because it's set in the Los Angeles area, which is well within the purview of what is covered by classic Fallout. This is the realm which classic Fallout fans are extremely familiar with. And so, when Lucy steps out into the wasteland, and it looks nothing at all like any classic Fallout fan is expecting, immediately that is cause for concern, and that concern is incredibly justified the further you get into the series. You see, one of the most common points of praise about the series is that it is very true to the games. The problem is that only applies for the Bethesda games, not Fallout 1, 2, or New Vegas. First problem you notice is that the wasteland appears very post-apocalyptic and not very post-apocalyptic. The civilization that you do find is the town of Philly, which is composed entirely of a bunch of ramshackle structures that are just slapped together with whatever random crap people can find. Everyone seems to be concerned only with subsistence survival, and the New California Republic, the dominant power in the region, which was a full-on nation-state as of Fallout 2 and New Vegas, is nowhere to be found at all. Now, that might be fine if the series were set, say, around the time that Fallout 76 takes place, but that is not when it takes place. It takes place in 2296. And in case you're wondering where that falls in relation to the rest of the games, it is 9 years after the events of Fallout 4, 15 years after the events of Fallout New Vegas, 19 years after the events of Fallout 3, 55 years after the events of Fallout 2, 99 years after the events of Fallout Tactics, 135 years after the events of Fallout 1, 194 years after the events of Fallout 76, and 219 years after the Great War itself ended. Per what we know from Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas, there should be plenty of civilization in the California region, especially in the area in which the show takes place. And that civilization should actually be fairly advanced, not necessarily high-tech like the society was prior to the war, but certainly in a more industrial capability. There would be factories, there would be large-scale farming and ranching, there would be people working regular jobs again instead of just having to scavenge for whatever random crap they can find just to survive. And yet, that is not the world of the Fallout TV series. When Lucy steps outside of Vault 33, she finds herself right next to the Santa Monica Pier. Now that gives us a helpful point of reference, because you see, Santa Monica is about 20 miles west of downtown Los Angeles. Downtown Los Angeles is the Boneyard, which was depicted in the original Fallout, and there's plenty of small villages there, at least as of Fallout 1. By the time you get to, say, New Vegas, the Boneyard would be quite a bit more developed. You would have larger settlements. You would have, of course, the Republic Reserve located in the Boneyard, which is where the New California Republic issues all of its fiat currency. Who knows what the status of that would be by 2296, of course, because it was already having pretty significant inflation problems by the time you get to New Vegas, and that was entirely because of the NCR Brotherhood War, which, by the way, the NCR won that war quite decisively, to the point where the Brotherhood of Steel in the West Coast region was almost completely annihilated and had to be in hiding as of the events of New Vegas. There were barely any of them left, even in the Mojave Wasteland, let alone in California. Anyway, I'm digressing here. The Santa Monica Pier gives us a point of reference that we can look at on the map of Fallout 1 and see that it would be right next to where the Boneyard is. And if you know anything about how Los Angeles County is, you know that there is basically massive urban sprawl between downtown Los Angeles and Santa Monica. So there shouldn't just be a massive empty desert surrounding the Santa Monica Pier. Again, right off the bat, things seem very wrong, and the more Lucy starts to explore the wasteland, the less things make sense. Again, this region is quite well established in the Fallout lore across not only Fallout 1 and 2, but even Fallout New Vegas. Obviously, New Vegas doesn't take place in the California region, it takes place in the Nevada region, but there's still plenty of references in that game back to things that are happening in California and places in California, so it's not like we still don't know what this region is supposed to be like. And yet, the way the TV show depicts it is not remotely what we know from the previous games. Now, of course, if you're being charitable, then you might describe it as them not necessarily depicting the entire region in its most accurate sense for the sake of the show's action or something like that. But then they go and implement a very significant retcon. One that is extremely egregious, and that is not only the location of Shady Sands, but what they actually did to it. So here's the thing about Shady Sands. Shady Sands started out in the original Fallout as a small village. By the time you get to Fallout 2, it has been renamed to New California Republic. And as the name implies, it is the seat of government for the New California Republic. By the time you get to Fallout New Vegas, it is being referenced as Shady Sands again, so either they renamed it back to Shady Sands, or people just kept using the name. Whatever the case may be, Shady Sands is well established as the capital of the New California Republic. And since it's a major location you visit in both Fallout 1 and 2, we know exactly where it is. And it is not located in the Los Angeles Boneyard like it's depicted in the show. It's located due east and just a bit south of San Francisco, which may not necessarily mean much to you if you don't know any Californian geography, but that puts it several hundred miles north of Los Angeles. This is not some obscure location that is only referenced once. It's the capital of the New California Republic. It is a major location. It is a place that you visit in 2 of the games and is referenced in a 3rd. It is not the kind of place you can just magically change the location of and get away with it. This is basically like if a new Lord of the Rings TV show came out and suddenly Isengard was depicted as being in the middle of the Shire. This goes way beyond a simple mistake. It is stupendously easy to verify this information, and yet the makers of the Fallout TV show failed to do so. More importantly, it's a company based out of California. They should fucking know where Los Angeles and San Francisco are in relation to one another, and thus where Shady Sands is supposed to be. Which, I feel the need to reiterate, is several hundred miles north of the Los Angeles Boneyard, not in the Los Angeles Boneyard. You may think I am being overly harsh on this. You may think I am harping on this point way too long. But if a company based out of California, more specifically the Los Angeles area, can't even get the basic geography of their own state correct, then what exactly does that say about them being accurate to the games themselves? Well, what it says is quite simple and quite obvious, and that is that the writers didn't give a shit. I have an extremely hard time believing the writers did anything more than some quick Googling just to get the general idea of the franchise, and then decided to just delve into the memes to figure out what people would be nostalgic for, and that way they could just shove those things into the show at different points to be like, oh, see, we're actually very true to the games. We get you, Fallout fans, even though none of that is actually substantial. I mean, people have been constantly pointing out things like Knight Titus running away from the Yaogwai, or Thaddeus shooting at Lucy and Maximus and missing every single shot, or the really big one that apparently persuaded most people that the people who worked on the Fallout TV show are real Fallout fans, which is, thou shalt get sidetracked by bullshit. But these are all surface level things that frankly don't even apply specifically to Fallout. And if it weren't for the sets and costumes telling you that it's a Fallout series, you wouldn't necessarily immediately think of Fallout. I mean, a guy running away from a big nasty monster? Throw a dart, you'll hit a game like that. Random chance to hit or miss a target resulting in you just constantly missing the target? Again, throw a dart, you'll hit a game like that. And as for the thou shalt get sidetracked by bullshit, congratulations, you've described every single open world game in existence. Now what you find very quickly is that if you remove the Fallout imagery itself, the things that you can look at and just immediately say, okay, that's Fallout stuff like Vault-Tec, Power Armor, Brotherhood of Steel, etc., etc., you find that the core of what made the original games so great isn't really there. Now, obviously, one of the big pillars of Fallout's design was player choice, and you're not going to get that in a TV series, so we can discount that. But the setting and the characters are something we can take a look at, and that is where this show completely falls apart as a piece of Fallout media. It's not just things like the location of Shady Sands being completely retconned. It's things like the way characters behave. Almost nobody in the series acts like you would really expect regular people to act. They're really more like caricatures or cartoon characters than anything else. Now, admittedly, a fair bit of that is the marvelization of film, TV, and video game dialogue that we've seen basically ever since the MCU got popular. But a lot of it is also due to the fact that Bethesda fans in general will associate dark humor with the Fallout series. And while they're not entirely wrong with that, they haven't necessarily gone back and played the original Fallout. The original Fallout actually is not a very funny game. There are a few jokes here and there, but they're very subdued. Fallout 2, on the other hand, is the one that started throwing all kinds of pop culture references at you, and frankly, they went too far with it, and they actually know that and acknowledge it, because when they made New Vegas, they toned that down considerably. But Bethesda didn't get that memo, so they made Fallout 3, 4, and 76 utterly ridiculous, and that's reflected in the TV series, because the TV series is almost exclusively based on Fallout 4 specifically. So, rather than being compelling characters with complex motivations, everybody's basically a caricature, and it's pretty much impossible to take any of the characters seriously. But at the same time, even though they are clearly trying to be funny, they're just not, and scenes that are clearly meant to be humorous in some way, like the one where Lucy and Maximus talk about having sex, just end up being so cringe-inducing they make you feel bad for everyone involved in making the scene in the first place. I mean, don't get me wrong, in a lot of scenes the actors are certainly trying to do what they can with what they got, but when what you've got is unsalvageable, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. So we've already established that the setting doesn't feel right, and if the characters don't feel right too, then what's left here? Well, there's the general plot and how it ties in with the Fallout lore, and this is where the whole thing completely collapses, because let me go ahead and just start with the Shady Sands thing, because I harped on that for a reason. So Shady Sands has been completely retconned out of where it was in Fallout 1 and 2 and is now suddenly in Los Angeles. And when it is depicted in the show, it is shown to be a very large crater. So they retconned its location and they destroyed it, and you find out through a chalkboard depicting basically the fall of the New California Republic that apparently Shady Sands, air quotes, fell in 2277. And the chalkboard timeline doesn't really do a very good job of saying whether Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277 or whether it somehow collapsed and then later was destroyed. Because it shows a mushroom cloud and it doesn't give a date for it, so it's hard to tell whether Shady Sands was destroyed in 2277 or whether it just collapsed in 2277. But either way, that's not possible based on what we know from Fallout New Vegas, because that game takes place in 2281, 4 years later, and Shady Sands is perfectly fine in that game. It obviously hadn't been destroyed, and it's not referenced as being in decline or having fallen or anything of that nature. It seems to be perfectly fine. The only major concerns with the New California Republic is that in the frontier regions, so the Mojave Wasteland and into the Baja California regions, they've overextended themselves a bit, so they can't really keep the order in those areas like they can in the Heartlands. Hence Caesar's Legion being such a threat in the region. The NCR doesn't really consider the Mojave Wasteland a priority, so they haven't allocated the kind of forces needed to repel the Legion, and thus they're running into problems. But that's in the Mojave Wasteland specifically, which is basically the far eastern frontier of the New California Republic. In the Heartlands, the only major concerns they seem to have are that there's not really enough grazing land for the herds, so that's why they're expanding into the Mojave Wasteland, and there's concerns about corruption, which is something that they'd been dealing with as far back as Fallout 2 anyway. There is just absolutely nothing in Fallout New Vegas that gives the impression that Shady Sands was in decline or had fallen, and yet, that is exactly what is depicted in the show. But it gets far worse than that, because not only had Shady Sands apparently fallen and been completely destroyed, but apparently the NCR went along with it. Because as I mentioned before, the NCR should be the absolute dominant force in the region, and yet, they're nowhere to be found. Why? I have absolutely no idea, because the show makes absolutely no attempt to explain it whatsoever. It lists Shady Sands as the first capital of the NCR, which implies that at some point they moved the capital somewhere else. Okay, fine, but if that was the case, then why, after the destruction of Shady Sands, did the NCR not send troops in to assess the situation and look for survivors and set up another settlement in the region or anything like that? Especially in the probably decade or so since the destruction of Shady Sands, because the show takes place in 2296, and since Maximus survived the destruction and is clearly not much older than maybe early to mid-20s, the time gap between the destruction of Shady Sands and the events of the show is probably around a decade, maybe a bit more. That is more than enough time for the NCR to re-secure the region, and yet they haven't. In fact, the only NCR forces in the entirety of the Los Angeles region are apparently Lee Moldaver's group, which consists of a cult composed of survivors of Shady Sands as well as just members of Vault 4 that is living entirely in Vault 4, who specifically worship or otherwise revere Lee Moldaver as the Flame Mother, which is of course incredibly weird, and more importantly, the actual NCR forces are reduced to just being a raider gang operating out of Griffith Observatory. Oh sure, when the Brotherhood of Steel shows up and attacks them in the final episode, they start waving around NCR flags, but before that, they just act like a raider gang, so they're a raider gang now. And in a so Bethesda it's actually legitimately headache-inducing move, the showrunners decide that the NCR needs to be completely wiped out by the Brotherhood of Steel, so that's exactly what happens in the final episode. Lucy brings the scientist's head to Lee Moldaver, she removes the tech from him, which turns out to be the key to unlocking cold fusion technology, which would provide effectively infinite energy in the region, and as this is going on, the Brotherhood of Steel shows up and attacks them. And because the Brotherhood of Steel are Bethesda's favorite faction, they completely annihilate what is apparently left of the New California Republic. And now that this raider gang that was apparently all that was left of the NCR is completely wiped out, that means that the Brotherhood of Steel now controls the cold fusion tech, making them the dominant power in the region. And we know it's not the West Coast Brotherhood that fans of Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas actually like, because they explicitly mention in the very first episode that the leadership of the Brotherhood is in the Commonwealth, which refers to the region formerly known as Massachusetts, in which Fallout 4 takes place. And what do you know, the airship that arrives to deliver some Brotherhood Knights is the Pridwin. Oh, before the show was out, they tried to say that it wasn't the Pridwin. They said it was something like the Caswinin or something like that. But when you actually see it in the show, they don't refer to it by name, but you actually see, printed on the side of the airship, it says Pridwin. So, it's the Pridwin, the command ship of Bethesda's Brotherhood of Steel on the East Coast. Which means there are only two possible canon endings to Fallout 4. Those are the Brotherhood of Steel ending and the Minuteman ending, because every other ending sees the Prydwen destroyed. So what exactly does this mean for Fallout? Well, it means that there is only one Brotherhood of Steel, and that is the Brotherhood of Steel, headquartered on the East Coast, and apparently operating across the entire American wasteland at this point. Which is a pretty interesting prospect because it had been well established by the point of Fallout 3, and New Vegas for that matter, that there were at least two distinct factions of Brotherhood of Steel. You had the West Coast Brotherhood and the East Coast Brotherhood. According to Fallout 3, there's also a rogue faction operating out of the Chicago area that the East Coast Brotherhood tried to reestablish contact with but never could. And supposedly this was meant to be a nod to the Brotherhood of Steel faction depicted in Fallout Tactics, even though Bethesda confirmed that Fallout Tactics was not canon when they were making Fallout 3. Because it would be a pretty significant conundrum to have the Midwestern Brotherhood depicted in Fallout Tactics operating in the modern wasteland, because they control the region from Colorado all the way to Illinois. It is effectively an empire built almost exclusively on conquest. That is what you do in Fallout Tactics. You just gradually expand the Brotherhood's influence across this entire region and conquer all threats to it. And obviously, such a high-tech, militaristic, expansionist faction wouldn't just let the East Coast Brotherhood go all the way across the US to make it to the Los Angeles region, and definitely wouldn't cede operational control to the East Coast Brotherhood, so Bethesda saying during the development of Fallout 3 that Tactics is no longer considered canon makes a lot of sense. That means that as of the Fallout TV show, theoretically there should be a West Coast Brotherhood and an East Coast Brotherhood. Except establishing that the leadership of the Brotherhood is in the Commonwealth means that there is now only the East Coast Brotherhood, so that means that the only Brotherhood of Steel is Bethesda's Brotherhood of Steel. Okay, that's a bit annoying, and it's certainly not explained in the show at all, but I can at least kind of see where the absolutely pathetic remnant faction that was the Brotherhood of Steel on the West Coast by the end of New Vegas would probably cede control of their operations over to the East Coast Brotherhood if they managed to reestablish contact with them. It's still hand-wavy and completely unexplained in the show, but at least it's a fairly quick and logical progression there. However, it does mean that since Bethesda's Brotherhood of Steel is now the only Brotherhood of Steel, that the showrunners packed the final episode with some very interesting symbolism. You see, again, the Brotherhood of Steel shows up and attacks what is apparently left of the New California Republic and completely annihilates it. Now, of course, the Brotherhood of Steel is the poster boy faction for Bethesda's Fallout games, so it has come to represent Bethesda's Fallout, and the NCR is a major part of Fallout 2 and New Vegas, so it has come to represent classic Fallout. And so, by the Brotherhood of Steel annihilating the NCR, you effectively have the idea of Bethesda Fallout destroying classic Fallout. This can be interpreted a few different ways, and one of the more fun interpretations I see is that Bethesda is still apparently incredibly jealous over Fallout New Vegas. Now, Chris Avellone has come out and said that there was apparently no animosity between Obsidian and Bethesda, but that may not necessarily be the case so much these days. Maybe during the development of Fallout 3 and New Vegas, there wasn't any animosity, but considering the decline in quality with Fallout 4 and 76, and yet New Vegas continues to be held quite highly despite its problems, there might actually be some animosity there. We haven't seen Bethesda let anyone else work on the Fallout franchise ever since New Vegas. And it's actually a pretty reasonable conclusion that Bethesda is so annoyed by the continued popularity of New Vegas over their games that they're just not going to let anybody else work on the franchise so they can't be upstaged again. And if we follow that line of thought, we can end up in a place where Bethesda just uses the TV show to effectively kill off classic Fallout and fully declare to the world that they're in control of the series now and what they say goes no matter what it is. And while that is certainly an amusing interpretation because it paints Bethesda as being incredibly petty about this whole thing, I really don't think that's actually what happened. Another interpretation might be that the showrunners are actually being a bit subtle and subversive there and are showing that Bethesda is destroying Fallout through the Brotherhood of Steel destroying the NCR. But obviously that is a completely delusional fantasy because it's abundantly clear if you actually watch the show that everything in it is based almost exclusively on Bethesda Fallout and has almost nothing to do with classic Fallout. I mean, hell, even when they show the classroom scene where Lucy's looking over the Fall of Shady Sands information and she pulls the NCR flag out, it plays the Fallout 4 theme, which clearly makes sense for the New California Republic, which wasn't in Fallout 4. Clearly, the Fallout 4 theme is a far superior choice than, I don't know, anything from Fallout New Vegas, including Righteous Republic, for example, or something from Fallout 2, or hell, even something like Big Iron, or I've Got Spurs That Jingle, Jangle, Jingle would be more appropriate than the friggin' Fallout 4 theme, but no, we play the Fallout 4 theme. So if that interpretation is a complete fantasy, what's the actual interpretation of this? Well, it's the same interpretation that you should have for everything in the Fallout TV show, which is that you just take everything at face value. Because that's modern Bethesda Fallout in a nutshell. There is no subtlety, there is no subversion, there is no intellectual or philosophical debate to be had. It is only the most superficial elements possible. And so, the symbolism of the Brotherhood destroying the NCR is a complete accident. They just wanted to have a big fight at the end, so they threw these two factions together and got their big fight scene. That's it. The only real reasons they used the NCR in this scene are, one, for a nostalgia bait like every single reference they make to something in the show, and two, because it would be really anticlimactic for the Brotherhood of Steel to just show up and wipe out a random raider gang. And since they can't use the Enclave as the main antagonist again, it has to be some other major faction that's in the area, and the only other major faction in the area is the New California Republic. So, if they wanted a big major faction versus major faction battle, they didn't have much of a choice but to use the Brotherhood versus the NCR. And since the Brotherhood are Bethesda's favorite faction, they have to win. It just doesn't go any further than that. And when you look at the rest of what they did to the established lore throughout the show, it becomes abundantly clear that the same exact philosophy was applied to everything. And it's not the philosophy of, okay, we have this big pile of established lore, characters, locations, etc. How do we build something from this? It's the philosophy of, okay, we've got this idea for something we think is cool and or funny. How do we make it look or sound like Fallout? It's the same kind of key-jangling technique we've seen with recent Star Wars productions, where they'll make references back to things that were in popular games or books or comics or whatever, and rather than actually doing that original source material justice, it's just a reference to get some quick nostalgia bait. I mean, it's not really related to the Fallout TV show, but to give you an example of something like that outside of this, Cad Bane shows up in the Book of Boba Fett, and barely does anything. But fans of the Clone Wars think he's a really cool character, so throwing him into the show gets it some quick brownie points. That is the exact same kind of thing that happens with the Fallout TV show. It doesn't actually do any real world building or even have a compelling story to tell. I mean, it's pretty much just a meandering regurgitation of Fallout 3's plot. Fallout 3 was, have you seen my father? He's an average-looking middle-aged man. And then, at the end, it's revealed that he actually left the vault because he's trying to work on a water purification project that will allow people in the Capital Wasteland to actually have a reliable source of clean water. The TV show basically does the same thing, only instead of a reliable source of clean water, it's effectively infinite energy, and instead of Lucy's father being a scientist with noble intentions, it's actually apparently Lee Moldaver who is the scientist with noble intentions, and Lucy's father turns out to be a Vault-Tec executive assistant who was cryogenically frozen and then awoken to oversee Vault 33 so that he can help Vault-Tec achieve their plans of world domination through monopolization? I wish I was joking about that, but that's the actual plot. The big reveals are that Lee Moldaver was working on cold fusion tech prior to the war, and theoretically that would solve the energy crisis that was really the root of the resource wars that had been plaguing the world for decades at that point. But since that would cut into the profits of the defense contractors, her efforts were stymied at every conceivable opportunity. And then we also find out that there was a secret meeting of Vault-Tec executives along with other defense contractors like Robco and Westtech, Robco of course being Robert House's company. And it was all of these companies together that agreed on using the vaults for human experimentation, and the only person at the meeting who even expressed any kind of dissent whatsoever is Robert House, and the only thing he was concerned with is how Vault-Tec could ensure that the vaults would be inhabited so these experiments could be run. At which point, Vault-Tec says that they can guarantee it by launching the first missile themselves. And they will do all of this to ensure that society progresses the way that they all want it to, because as it currently exists, we have too much conflict and war never changes. So, here's a few things about this. First, the experiments in the vaults were explicitly mentioned in Fallout 2 specifically as the Enclave, the American deep state, specifically going out of their way to gather data for their big projects, which they believe would ensure humanity's not only survival, but restoration as the dominant species on Earth, as well as ensure America's position as the dominant nation on Earth. So while it was Vault-Tec running all these experiments, they were running them on behalf of the Enclave. And there was no indication that any of the other major defense contractors were able to get in on the Vault-Tec experiments. In fact, in New Vegas, when you talk to the leadership at Big MT, they outright tell you that Vault-Tec was way better at running social experiments than anybody else, and that if these other companies wanted to run experiments, they had to do things like either select towns to run experiments on, or outright create towns themselves to run experiments in. And that lack of collusion didn't take away from the cartoonish villainy of Vault-Tec, nor did it take away from the cartoonish villainy, ineptitude, and general bad luck of a lot of these other corporations. But now they've basically made the entire thing out to be Vault-Tec's idea right from the beginning, not the American deep state that would become the Enclave. Now, I know they did this because their minimal amount of Google searching they did to figure out what the main points of Fallout are told them that Vault-Tec is an evil corporation doing evil corporation things, and they just decided to make Vault-Tec the villain of the entire Fallout series instead of just a villain in the Fallout series. And the especially annoying thing about all of this is just how short-sighted everything is. They thought that making Vault-Tec the villain of the Fallout series would be either some big reveal or that Fallout fans would really appreciate it. But really, the only thing I can really think about it is that it's currently in vogue to say capitalism bad, and since corporations are a part of capitalism, that means that Vault-Tec have to be the bad guys. I'm not arguing that they aren't bad guys. They're definitely evil. We've known that for a long time. But they were frankly far more interesting as often incompetent stooges of the Enclave rather than villainous masterminds who will stop at nothing to reshape the world in the image they want so that they can profit the most from it. Villains in classic Fallout were not just the result of capitalism bad. Even organizations as cartoonishly villainous as the Enclave or as irredeemable as Caesar's Legion, had more complex motivations and rationale for doing what they were doing than we want to control the world to maximize our profits. But frankly, as dumb as their motivation is, the worst part about making Vault-Tec the villains of the entire Fallout franchise is that it's just really indicative of the general Bethesda philosophy for developing these games. They'll implement an idea thinking that it's cool or funny or something along those lines, and not really consider at all how it fits in with established lore, or how it fits in with the series' established themes and motifs, or even whether it makes any kind of sense whatsoever. It's how we've ended up with so many blatant retcons over the course of Bethesda's handling of the series, and how they've just handled those retcons incredibly poorly. The idea of establishing a sense of continuity and of building up the world over time just isn't something Bethesda is concerned with. They'll implement things purely for gameplay reasons and then make up a really half-assed explanation for them in the lore that ends up retconning, say, 20 years of established lore. Prime example there is what they did to power armor as of Fallout 4, where all power armor suits apparently have the same exact exoskeleton design, and then on this exoskeleton you fit the plates that turn it into T-45, T-51, or the other suits of power armor that they introduced in Fallout 4, and which they introduce exclusively as pre-war items. So you have a new T-60 power armor that is the most advanced power armor in production prior to the Great War wiping out all life on the planet, which directly contradicts the 20-ish years of established lore where T-51 was the most advanced power armor developed, and it wasn't until the Enclave made advanced power armor that anything more advanced than T-51 would be in any kind of actual use. And the Enclave didn't start researching technologies that would lead to the advanced power armor suits until about 2198, and they weren't able to put any advanced power armor in production until 2220. But Bethesda didn't care about that. They just thought that a new suit of power armor would be fun for gameplay purposes, and they wanted something that they thought looked cool, so they made a new T-60 power armor and made it pre-war, thus taking a hatchet to the lore when they could have done something legitimately interesting with it and made it a post-war suit that the Brotherhood developed in an attempt to maintain and improve upon their old decaying suits of power armor, particularly the T-45, since it looks like T-60 is basically just a slightly upgraded T-45. But nope, that wouldn't line up with Bethesda's utter refusal to create anything new for the franchise that allows Fallout to continue moving forward. Everything has to be looking back, so T-60 has to be a pre-war suit. And to make matters worse for Bethesda in this regard, they made a major gameplay change to the way power armor worked in Fallout 4, and they continued that on into 76. And that was the introduction of fusion cores, which are basically batteries that allow the power armor to function. They're also used as ammunition for certain large energy weapons like the laser Gatling, but primarily they're for your power armor. And while it was perfectly fine from a gameplay perspective, albeit a bit annoying having to go find more fusion cores so you could operate your power armor longer than a few minutes, not that it was ever really a problem because the game threw them at you like candy, but that's beside the point. The problem is that power armor up until Fallout 4 was well established to have a miniature reactor in it that was capable of powering the suit for hundreds of years. And that was true from Fallout 1 all the way up to Fallout New Vegas. So this sudden change in Fallout 4 is a major conflict with the established lore, and Bethesda made absolutely no attempt to explain the change whatsoever. To them, this was all just a bunch of gameplay changes that made sense, but when you look at it in the grand scheme of the Fallout franchise, it's a pretty massive retcon to power armor, and this whole idea of a universal chassis upon which you mount plates that turn it into T-45, T-51, whatever, and these are all interchangeable so you can have a Frankenstein suit made of a bunch of different types. It just doesn't make any sense from a lore perspective. And remember, this is only one thing that they have made changes to purely for either gameplay or aesthetic reasons, and not considered how it will impact the long-standing lore. And another prime example of that has created a debate among supposed Fallout fans as to whether modern-day weaponry belongs in Fallout or not. And if you've only played Fallout 4 and 76, you're probably going to say no, it doesn't. But if you've played any of the games prior to that, you know that they included modern-day weaponry all the time. I mean, even the original Fallout had a Desert Eagle available in it. And then when you got up to Fallout 2, they included quite a few more modern weapons, as well as a few prototypes, and obviously energy weapons and things like that. You had things like, of course, the Desert Eagle returning, but you also had stuff like the P90, or the so-called LSW, or Light Support Weapon, which is clearly modeled after an L86. Or you moved into prototype weaponry, like, say, the H&K G11, or the H&K CAWS. Things that absolutely exist in the real world, and some of which were very recent at the time these games were being developed. And Fallout Tactics had even more modern-day weapons in it. Then you move over into Fallout 3, and they went back to a bit more Cold War era stuff, like modeling the so-called assault rifle after the H&K G3, even though it's not actually a G3, considering it's chambered in 5.56 in the game, which would make it more of an HK93. But in-game, it looks more like a G3, or more specifically a SETME, so they just didn't really get the modeling consistent with the actual caliber. That's nitpicky stuff there. The point is that even in Fallout 3, they had modern-day, or relatively modern in the case of more Cold War era stuff. And then you move over into New Vegas, and they also had modern-day weaponry, including stuff like AR pattern rifles, which means that modern weapons definitely belong in Fallout. And yet, if you only played Fallout 4 and 76, you would get the impression that they don't belong in Fallout, because they went out of their way to make the weapons in those look like they came out of the 50s or earlier. And frankly, they look pretty awful, so they really shouldn't stick with those designs. Anyway, point there is that they made that change for aesthetic reasons. They felt like these weapons fit in better with the retro-futurist aesthetic, and ended up creating weapons that not only clash with their own previous game, Fallout 3, but also with every other game in the series, and thus they clearly didn't consider the impact on lore or just people's general perception of the Fallout franchise. But what's even worse in this particular case is that they didn't even consider whether any of the changes they were making actually made any sense or not. To give you some prime examples of that, when you find hunting rifles out in the wastelands in Fallout 4 and 76, or combat rifles or whatever, they are always in an obres configuration, meaning that they have the entire stock sawed off, and they have the entire barrel sawed off. They're basically pistols. And there is absolutely no logical reason to do that to a rifle, especially one chambered in a more full-power cartridge like 308. The reason that was done to, say, Mosin Nagants way back in the day is because people who were making those didn't have access to regular pistols, and they wanted something in a more pistol configuration, so they cut down what they could get, which was full-sized Mosin Nagant rifles, into something that was kind of like a pistol. And they were just terrible. They ruined the ballistics of those full-power rifle cartridges. They had incredibly high recoil because there wasn't anything to direct the recoil back into your shoulder. It all went directly into your arms. And the muzzle blast was just awful. Again, this was something that was done out of desperation, something that they did because they didn't have access to pistols, not because it's actually a good idea. And yet, when you play Fallout 4 and 76 and you pick up a hunting rifle, it's in an obres configuration. You pick up a combat rifle, it's in an obres configuration, and for some baffling reason, it's chambered in 45 ACP, which is a pistol cartridge. But hey, at least those actually resemble somewhat functional firearms. Whenever you pick up a pipe pistol or a pipe rifle or whatever, they're just completely awful, and there's no logical way they could ever actually function. And it's not like Fallout hasn't had improvised weapons before. It's had things like pipe rifles, but the way they did it in the past actually made sense because it was either a sort of musket-type configuration or basically made out to be a single-shot breech loader. See, those make perfect sense for improvised weapons that would be present in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, not the really bizarre pipe contraptions that are meant to be semi-automatic, full-automatic, revolvers, things that are actually fairly complicated to make unless you have actual tools to work with, and they clearly didn't with these designs, so I don't know what they were thinking with that. And the end result is just weapon designs that don't make any actual sense. That's the kind of thing that happens when you make changes purely for aesthetic reasons. And some of the worst stuff Bethesda has done to Fallout is when they have tried to implement things they just think is either funny or weird or interesting, only to just completely ruin a whole subject. For example, there is one hidden quest in Fallout 4 where you stumble upon someone who is locked in a fridge, and when you let them out, you find that it's a ghoul who has actually been stuck in that fridge for 200 years. He survived the Great War in a fridge, and he's still perfectly fine 200 years later, having had no access to food, water, or air. Now, don't get me wrong, it was established prior to this particular game that ghouls can go longer than regular people without food and water, but they still need to breathe. And while they certainly live a long time, they do still age, so it's not like this guy would just be locked in a fridge for 200 years and effectively be in permastasis. It's just utterly ridiculous, and while they clearly put it into the game as something of a joke, they clearly didn't consider what kind of impact that would have on ghoul lore. And these are only a few examples of the kinds of things Bethesda has been doing to Fallout without considering the impact it has on the broader franchise. And that is exactly the same kind of writing style that is used in the TV show. They pull the exact same thing with ghouls. Even in the very first episode, they dig the ghoul himself, Cooper Howard, out of a grave where the only thing that would have been even remotely supplying him nutrients and or fluids is a single fluid pack that has a line going into the ground. And they explicitly mention that he is kept in that grave for months until eventually somebody digs him up and carves pieces off of him for some reason and then puts him back in there. They dig him out, and he's fine. I mean, he's a bit stiff from being stuck in a coffin the whole time, but he stretches out and he's fine. And then during the fight in Philly, he gets shot several times and just shrugs it off like it's nothing because the flesh just mends itself almost immediately, which is far beyond the regenerative capabilities of any ghoul we've ever seen in the franchise, and it's also only selectively used because we see feral ghouls later on who presumably would have the same regenerative capabilities even if their brain functions have been degraded, and yet they just go down like any other wasteland creature. I mean, they obviously establish things like headshots, destroying the brain or removing the head entirely, are sufficient to take out a ghoul permanently, but other than that, there's just not really any consistency to it. Ghouls are effectively immortal super beings in the TV show universe, except, of course, when they aren't. And apparently now there is some sort of specific drug that they need to take in order to keep themselves from going feral, even though that has absolutely never been a thing in any of the Fallout games at all. In the show, it's just used as a plot device for a very brief subplot that ends up not going anywhere at all, and it's obvious they didn't even remotely consider what it means for Fallout as a whole. Does that mean that in the next Fallout game we're going to see ghouls having to take this stuff constantly? Are we going to see quests surrounding it? Is it going to be explained at all? Probably not. And are ghouls in the next Fallout game going to be immortal super beings that can just shrug off anything you throw at them unless you just blow their head off? Probably not, although to be fair, Bethesda enemies are all bullet sponges regardless of what they are, so you can end up with a similar effect anyway. Oh, and speaking of ghouls, do you think we're going to be able to be turned into one like Thaddeus is in the TV show? Because that's something that happens. A weird snake oil salesman type character ends up giving him a concoction that allows him to rapidly heal from a severe injury, and later on he triggers a trap that launches I think it's supposed to be a crossbow bolt, through his neck, and he's fine, pulls the crossbow bolt out of his neck, and the wound closes up just fine. He's fine, because he's a ghoul now. Because apparently we're just going to completely retcon the almost 30 years of established Fallout lore that says ghouls are the result of radiation exposure and not of some sort of chemical concoction. And before anybody mentions the drug that Hancock in Fallout 4 took that turned him into a ghoul, he did explicitly mention that it was an experimental radiation drug, which means that he got exposed to a high degree of radiation. Not to mention, he looks and sounds like you would expect a ghoul to look and sound, whereas Thaddeus just looks like a normal person, so, I guess he wasn't exposed to a massive amount of radiation all at once. I really don't know. But what I know for certain is that they've perma-screwed the ghoul lore for the sake of jokes that weren't even all that funny, and the sake of plot conveniences that don't really seem to go anywhere. And frankly, you could say the same for pretty much anything in the Fallout TV series, for that matter. You see, things just sort of happen in the Fallout TV series, with little to no thought given for continuity or even just basic sensibilities. Things like a bunch of Brotherhood initiates beating the crap out of Maximus in broad daylight in the middle of camp, and nobody even making an attempt to stop it. Is that just something the Brotherhood of Steel, an organization known for its structure and order, is just going to let happen? Because that just gives the impression the Brotherhood of Steel really doesn't care about its members or about the value of life at all, and that's not remotely in character for them. Now, on the West Coast, certainly they have not been depicted as knights in shining armor like they were in Fallout 3, but they were depicted as being insular and highly disciplined. In other words, they look after their own people and they strictly enforce their own rules. And that's just not the impression you get from the portrayal of the Brotherhood throughout the TV show. Nobody stops Maximus from getting beaten up by other initiates, and there is absolutely no punishment for those other initiates. When Maximus is eventually assigned to Knight Titus as a squire, which, by the way, the rank of squire in the Brotherhood of Steel has absolutely nothing to do with being the servant of a knight. Because that's how they're portrayed in the show. They're just servants of the knights, and that's not how they were in the games. The rank of squire was reserved for new recruits into the Brotherhood or people who had been born into the Brotherhood and aren't yet old enough to be on active duty, so instead they just run errands around the bases and such like that in exchange for education, and then once they come of age, then they become an initiate, and then they take on active duties. There has been absolutely nothing in the established Fallout lore up to this point that says that Brotherhood squires are servants to knights that they're assigned to. And before you say, well, that might be a West Coast chapter thing, no, it's not, because it's not a thing in any of the Fallout games set on the West Coast. Nor is it a thing in New Vegas, nor is it a thing in Fallout Tactics, nor is it a thing in Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, nor is it even a thing in the Bethesda Fallout games set on the East Coast. Which is especially relevant because, again, when the Pridwin shows up, it confirms that the leadership of this part of the Brotherhood of Steel is the same leadership that operates in the Commonwealth and in the Capital Wasteland. Again, it's all one big Brotherhood of Steel under the Bethesda umbrella, so they should all be under the same exact structure, and no part of that has ever established squires as being servants to knights. It is literally just something that they made up for the TV show because the writers heard that the Brotherhood of Steel uses knightly terms and can be considered a sort of knightly order, and thought, well, if they got knights, the knights need squires, so let's make them squires and make the squires servants to the knights and stuff. Oh, and what's even funnier about this whole dynamic is that knights in the Brotherhood of Steel have long been established to be veteran members of the Brotherhood who have earned the right to wear power armor. Although, in the case of knights, it's usually T-45 or otherwise weaker suits. It's not until you get to the paladin rank that you can get the really good stuff like T-51, or as of the Bethesda games, T-60. But anyway, point is that the Knights of the Brotherhood have proven themselves worthy of wearing power armor, presumably by being combat veterans, on top of exemplifying the values of the Order. Which is clearly why Knight Titus, the knight that Maximus is assigned to as squire, is very dismissive of his squire's inquiries regarding the power armor that the squire is supposed to help the knight maintain. And he tells the vertibird pilots to land because he's bored and wants to shoot something. And when they stumble upon a cave full of radioactive waste, he tells his squire, who has absolutely no gear capable of repelling radiation, to go in there and check it out, even though he's wearing the power armor and thus would actually have resistance to radiation. And when they investigate the cave, they find that it's the home of a Yaoguai, which, for those of you who don't know, is a very large mutated grizzly bear. And despite his power armor being more than sufficient to protect him and allow him to fight this Yaoguai, he instead runs away from it, and if it weren't for the fact that it wasn't chasing after Maximus, he would have left Maximus to die. And then after they've dealt with the Yaoguai, Titus orders Maximus to help him get the helmet off and then to apply a stim pack, while complaining and whining about the mission of the Brotherhood being apparently not worth it because they have you doing things like tracking down toaster ovens and such. And clearly this absolutely pathetic excuse of a man absolutely exemplifies what being a Brotherhood Knight is all about. Clearly this is the kind of individual that the Brotherhood of Steel would trust with a suit of very rare, very difficult and expensive to maintain, and very potentially dangerous power armor. It's like the showrunners just decided that the Brotherhood of Steel is really nothing more than another Wastelander group that just happens to be better equipped than everyone else, when in reality, the Brotherhood was founded by remnants of the US military, and they've maintained a quasi-religious but very strictly military doctrine and training regimen ever since their founding. The kind of behavior you see from Knight Titus, and also Maximus for that matter, simply does not fly in the Brotherhood of Steel. They take their missions, their equipment, their training, and their discipline very seriously. Or at least they did until the TV show's writers got their hands on them. And when you look at the grand scheme of things, you realize that Titus was only used as a plot device. He's only such a douchebag so that it doesn't make Maximus look like a villain for letting him die and then taking the power armor from him. Now, on the positive side with that, they do make it obvious that Maximus has no actual training on power armor, and so he's just bumbling his way around in it. But then you get to the end of the series, and you have the big Brotherhood assault on the Griffith Observatory, and when they get into the main corridor of the observatory, a group of Brotherhood Knights in full power armor with heavy weaponry, along with roughly a squad's worth of initiates with not much more than pistols and basically no armor at all, end up encountering the Ghoul. And this is where the prowess of the Brotherhood's Knights really shines, because they stand there and stare at the Ghoul as he slowly loads armor-piercing rounds into his revolver, and prattles on to them about how the armor must make them feel like big men, because he remembers wearing power armor back when he was in the military prior to the Great War, and how it made him feel like a big man too. And he goes on about how there was a flaw in the power armor back then that was in the welds just below the chest plate, and he wonders if they fixed that in the newer model. Then proceeds to slam his revolver shut and shoot one of the Brotherhood Knights in that exact spot, and kill the guy instantly. And the Brotherhood still just stand there staring at him as this knight now just slumps to the ground dead, and he just goes, "I guess not." Then they start shooting at him, missing every single shot as he pulls the fusion core out of the nearby power generator and causes all the lights to go out. And these Brotherhood Knights, who should know how their power armor works, all somehow forgot that every single T-45, T-51, and T-60 power armor helmet has a lamp on it. All they would have to do to restore visibility and be able to reasonably fight the Ghoul is to turn on those lamps and go right back to it. But no, they just shoot blindly into the darkness and let themselves get annihilated. And while that's arguably the biggest display of sheer stupidity from the Brotherhood, even before that, in the build-up to them getting into the observatory itself, where they're just charging through and fighting in the courtyard, it's like absolutely nobody, whether it's the Raider gang that's apparently what's left of the NCR, or the Brotherhood of Steel, actually knows how to fight. I mean, the Brotherhood sends in a full combat force on multiple vertibirds, complete with several knights in full power armor with their god-awful Fallout 4 assault rifle, heavy machine gun, whatever the hell you want to call it. I don't care, it's an abomination, let's put it that way. But anyway, some of the knights have these big, heavy weapons, and then almost everybody else that the Brotherhood sends in is armed with nothing more than a pistol. Meanwhile, when the NCR-ish faction runs in, they're armed with rifles and shotguns and submachine guns and pistols. And when Moldaver herself steps out of the observatory and gets into her ready pose, she's got a laser pistol, which is one of 3 energy weapons we see in the entire show. The other ones are a laser musket we see in the background in episode 2, and laser rifles that guards have at the Enclave base, and absolutely none of them ever get fired. So all of these energy weapons might as well not even exist in the show. So it seems like the NCR Raider gang, whatever the hell you want to call them, have better weaponry than the Brotherhood, which makes beyond no sense. But it doesn't matter because every single character in the show is apparently a moron with the self-preservation instincts of a lemming. I mean, I can understand the Brotherhood Knights just charging into battle because they're wearing power armor. They are very well protected. But even the basic troops that the Brotherhood has and the NCR troops just charge into each other. Everybody seems to have forgotten that the major advantage of a firearm is that it is a ranged weapon. You do not need to get close to somebody to do damage to them with one, and yet that is exactly what everybody in this last battle does. One of them has a light machine gun, an RPD, the kind of thing that you would tactically use by providing suppressing fire so that your other squad mates can maneuver into position, and he just runs up to somebody, shoots him once in the chest with it, and then gets shot in the chest himself by another guy who's nearby with a pistol. And hell, one person on each side of the conflict ends up just charging into battle with nothing but a flag. They don't even have weapons, they just charge in with flags and wave them around. Like, did nobody just stop and think about this for a millisecond? I can understand charging a guy in power armor and then trying to force him down so that somebody can get up there and shoot into the gaps of the armor. That at least makes sense. But that only happens once, and everybody else just seems to think that guns are melee weapons instead of ranged weapons. It is utterly ridiculous. And the only time anybody does anything remotely resembling using cover is when that group of Brotherhood Knights and Initiates and whatever goes into the observatory, and the non-armored guys stand behind the guys in power armor to let the guys in power armor take the initial shots. But it's like they only figured that out once they got up to the observatory. Like, they had no idea what they were doing before then, and even then, you have the whole mess of lights go out and the guys in power armor forget they have lamps, and then that whole squad gets annihilated anyway. It's just, everything that happens in this damn show is stupid. We've already well established that they didn't even remotely consider the impact any of these kinds of things would have on established lore or setting information or anything like that. But even just ignoring the Fallout aspect of it, just looking at it as a TV show, nobody behaves like you would expect a rational person or even a relatively irrational person to behave. Everybody acts like a moron, nobody has any kind of self-preservation instincts except for the main characters, and even they are just kind of dependent on the individual scene. Sometimes they're really stupid too. And rather than having any kind of sensible progression, everything just happens out of nowhere for plot convenience. Everybody just says or does things because the writers said so, not because it actually makes any sense for them to do. And the further you get into the season, the worse this effect gets. It's actually not so bad in the first 2 or 3 episodes, but then once you get to episode 4 and onwards, it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and the only real highlights of the show end up being the set and costume design, the prop design, and occasionally the acting when the actors are allowed to do things that aren't just incredibly stupid or cringe-inducing. Hell, that's why people like Walton Goggins in the show so much. He's a good actor to begin with, but he's allowed to do things that aren't just really stupid or cringe-inducing. Aaron Moten, on the other hand, isn't allowed to flex any kind of acting chops he might have because Maximus, the character he plays, pretty much never has a situation where he's not doing something either dumb or cringe-inducing. And the very, very few moments he does get are basically in the first couple of episodes. Again, there were just so many times throughout this show where I just felt bad for the cast and crew because they tried. They certainly tried. But no amount of them trying their hardest could ever fix the utterly dogshit writing and often pretty dogshit direction. The showrunners certainly tried their hardest to distract you from all of that stuff by shoving in as many references to the Fallout games as they could, but that's just it. They're references. They're not actually anything substantial. It's all just a blatant attempt to hide all of their screw-ups under a veneer of, see, we get you, Fallout fans. Look at this thing that was in the games. Wasn't that cool in the games? We got it in the show too. Doesn't that make the show cool? It's basically jangling keys in front of your face and expecting you to be distracted long enough to not notice that the rest of the show is just crap. And the problem I have with this is not just that it's deceptive and frankly insulting to the audience's intelligence, but that apparently it worked. Because the general discourse around the TV show online has been basically nothing but an endless cacophony of people screeching that the show is amazing, that it's the best piece of Fallout media in decades, that it's so true to the lore and the series canon and continuity, that the showrunners are clearly fans of the games because they get so many little references right. And that anybody who doesn't like the show is either just a contrarian or just a butthurt New Vegas fan. And fuck those New Vegas fans, am I right? They're just the worst. And while that is exactly the behavior I would expect out of Bethesda fans at this point, I've seen even people claiming to be fans of the earlier games trying to go to bat for this absolute slop. Even Tim Kaine, legendary director of a game you may have heard of called The Outer Worlds. Oh wait, that's not it. Yeah, The Outer Worlds wasn't actually very good. Oh, right, he was one of the co-creators of the original Fallout. That's what it is. A lot of people say he's the creator of Fallout, but no, he's one of the creators of Fallout, and then he left during Fallout 2's development, so he hasn't actually been involved in the series for quite a long time at this point. But anyway, he went to bat for this series and said that he enjoyed it, and that it doesn't really matter what anybody thinks about the lore and all that sort of thing at this point, because he's not in charge, and neither are any of us. No, we actually know that, Tim. We're well aware of that. We know the people in charge of it are actually Emil Pagliarulo, and to a far lesser extent, Todd Howard. Why do I say it's mostly Emil? Well, the simple fact of the matter is, he has been the lead writer at Bethesda ever since Fallout 3. Which means that every single lore inconsistency, every single retcon, every bit of just downright stupid and awful writing that has come out of Bethesda over the past, nearly 2 decades at this point, ultimately falls upon Emil's shoulders. And so he is effectively the keeper of Fallout, Elder Scrolls, and now Starfield. And funnily enough, in the aftermath of the TV show, he actually proved me right on the writer's mentality with regards to this franchise. As a quick reminder, even though I've already repeated myself several times on this, the writers of Fallout do not care about established series continuity, they do not care about their writing being in keeping with established series lore, and they don't even really care about whether it actually makes any sense or not. As long as they think it's fun or funny, then they're just gonna throw it into the game with almost no explanation, if any at all, and they just don't care what it does. If it retcons now nearly 30 years of established lore and all that, so be it. That is their current writing philosophy, and it applies not just for Fallout, but it also applies for Elder Scrolls. They have been retconning the living crap out of that for decades now. As a quick example of that, Cyrodiil is referenced in earlier Elder Scrolls games as being a jungle, and yet when you played Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, which is set in Cyrodiil, it's a generic medieval European fantasy world. And they didn't bother to provide any kind of explanation for it until Elder Scrolls Online. At which point they said, oh, it was either Tiber Septim changed the entire geography of Cyrodiil to better fit the Imperials, or it was just a mistranslation. Oh, Bethesda. Anyway, back to the Fallout franchise and how they've just, perma-fucked it. So, Emil comes out after the TV show and all the, Shady Sands, NCR, confusion, and general irritation, all that, and says he thinks that people are confused over the timeline of events. So he decided to be helpful and posted a timeline of when all of the different canon Fallout games take place, and when the show falls in with that. And I have a screenshot of that tweet here for you. You might notice something interesting about it, which is that, according to Emil, Fallout Tactics is canon, which creates all kinds of lore questions and problems. Because, for those of you who don't know, Fallout Tactics has you playing as a new member of the Brotherhood of Steel in the Midwest, which is its own specific chapter, and that game sees you conquering the territory spanning from Colorado all the way to Illinois. So by the end of the game, not only is the Brotherhood of Steel in the Midwest a vast empire, but depending on the player's actions, it can either be one that is hell-bent on wiping out everything that is not a pure, in massive air quotes, human, similar to what the Enclave were trying to do in Fallout 2, or it can be an empire that outlaws discrimination against non-humans and mutants and actually leads to prosperity for everybody in its territory. Because, fun fact, one of the things you can do in Fallout Tactics is recruit ghouls and mutants and even Deathclaws into your ranks. And yeah, you heard me right, Deathclaws. You can recruit Deathclaws in Fallout Tactics. And all this kind of stuff simply will not fly with either the West Coast Brotherhood of Steel or the East Coast Brotherhood of Steel. And the really funny thing about Tactics is that even though fans of the series have never really considered it to be canon, it actually played things a lot less fast and loose than Bethesda has ever done with the franchise. So weirdly enough, despite the Brotherhood of Steel in the Midwest clearly being a different chapter of the Brotherhood with different ideals, and despite them using different power armor, the rest of the game actually doesn't conflict much, or really at all, with the rest of established series lore. So you have a really weird situation where the non-canon spin-off is actually a lot closer to the classic series lore than the actual mainline entries are. It's kind of baffling, actually, but anyway. The point here is that Emil included Fallout Tactics in the list of canon entries in the series, which means that at the very least on some level, Fallout Tactics is now considered to be canon. Which directly contradicts what Todd Howard himself said about Fallout Tactics in 2007. I have the quote right here, highlighted for ease of viewing. He said, "For our purposes, neither Fallout Tactics nor Fallout Brotherhood of Steel ever happened." And now we have the lead writer at Bethesda completely contradicting that statement by including Fallout Tactics among the lists of canon entries of the series. So what is it, Bethesda? Is it canon? Is it not canon? Is it partially canon? If it's partially canon, you better make sure you explain what parts of it are canon, because there's a heck of a lot of stuff in Fallout Tactics. But let's face it, we all know they're not going to explain it, they're just gonna hand-wave it away. Because at the end of the day, everything Bethesda does with their writing is basically just Emil opening his mouth and saying something stupid without even remotely thinking about it first. I mean, to give you another prime example of this, in the aftermath of the TV show, Emil decided to reveal that, given the great vibes recently, he decided it was time to share an unknown link between Fallout 1 and Fallout 4. So, apparently, during the opening cutscene of Fallout 4, where it depicts the annexation of Canada, there are 2 American soldiers in power armor. And Emil circled the one on the left and said that that is Nate, the player character from Fallout 4, if you play a male character anyway. Now, the really funny thing about this is that he specifically says that he's not the shooter, because he knows that the scene shows these 2 American soldiers executing a prisoner of war, thereby committing a war crime. The thing is, when the guy on the right actually executes the POW, the guy on the left laughs about it. So apparently the player character of Fallout 4, if you choose to play a male player character, is a war criminal. You know, just a fun fact there. And then he very quickly backtracked on this. And he outright admits what he does. He says he gets dumb when he gets excited, and he gets excited a lot. And then he has the audacity to go on about, when you're world and character building, you have a lot of headcanon. You're always sorting ideas. And obviously none of those ideas are, maybe I should actually consider things before just blurting stuff out. And then he goes on to say, it wasn't shared with the player because it was never meant to be who we think Nate is. For a player, Nate's soldier pass is whatever we think it is. That is canon. So, funny thing about that, we have almost no say over what the characterization of Nate or Nora is in Fallout 4. That's all predetermined because they wanted to go the Mass Effect route and have fully voiced dialogue. And that whole thing was done so poorly that not even Bethesda fans liked it, let alone longtime series fans, or really just people in general, frankly. So whatever we think is canon on Nate and Nora doesn't matter, because predefined characters have a predefined backstory, whether it's revealed or not, and now Emil has revealed a part of Nate's backstory, and that's that he's a war criminal. Good job, Emil. But aside from that, your admission that whatever the player thinks is canon, even though you are only referring to Nate's backstory in this, actually is opening up Pandora's box. Because if the player's preferences for what is considered canon or not supersede that of the writers, we are free to declare whatever the hell we want as canon or non-canon. And sure, we were always able to say, well, I think this thing is canon versus this thing is not canon, but it was always our personal opinions. But now you have officially said that whatever the player thinks is canon. And depending on the player, that can get real interesting real quick. Because sure, you'll undoubtedly end up with a bunch of people saying Fallout 1, 2, and New Vegas are canon and everything else is basically just shitty fanfiction, but then you'll have some people including Fallout Tactics in the canon, and some very disturbed individuals including Fallout Brotherhood of Steel in the canon. And then you'll have some people determining that only the Bethesda games, Fallout 3, 4, and 76 are canon, and so on and so forth. The canon is now perma-fucked. Good job, Emil. Good job, Bethesda. Good job, showrunners of the Fallout TV series. I am sure you are all very proud of yourselves for the slop you have produced, but this was the final nail in the coffin for Fallout. Bethesda have just been parading this withered husk of a series around for the past decade or so, while fans of classic Fallout have held a tiny amount of hope that maybe one day they might either outsource a game to Obsidian, or they might actually get a clue and we would actually see a proper Fallout game again. But they've made it abundantly clear they are not going to do that. But hey, on the positive side, if they're not going to give a single solitary shit about the continuity or lore of the games that they are producing and the TV show that they're attached to, then why the hell should anyone? I mean, you see people complaining all the time about mods, for example, for Fallout 4, that more or less turn it into a weird, janky version of single-player Tarkov or whatever, and whine about it not being lore-friendly, but it's a Bethesda Fallout game, and Bethesda doesn't give a shit about the lore. They can and will change whatever the hell they want, whenever the hell they want, on an entirely arbitrary basis without any considerations for what kind of impact it has on the setting or lore, thus making the term lore-friendly a friggin' joke. They have taken a franchise that was built upon strong writing, both in terms of setting and characters and dialogue and all that sort of thing, along with its very strong role-playing game design, and have utterly massacred what made the series good in the first place in favor of turning them all into mindless, soulless, janky action games whose only real redeeming quality is that they are highly moddable. And obviously, with the exception of moddability, the TV show reflects that. It is almost completely devoid of substance, it has no logical consistency to it whatsoever, both on a Fallout level and just on a TV show level in general, and the only reason that anybody would actually enjoy it is if they completely shut their brain off the entire time they were watching, because it does not stand up to even the slightest bit of critical scrutiny. But unfortunately for the show, even if you do shut your brain off, it's still garbage. So the fact that so many people out there are just guzzling this up and acting like it's the best thing ever tells me that either people were just so utterly bewildered that the series is even slightly watchable that they considered it a masterpiece by default, or the audience is composed almost exclusively of Bethesda fans who don't give a shit about this kind of stuff anyway, they just want mindless stupidity. Or there's also just the possibility of the brain rot affecting the general population just hitting a critical mass or something. I don't know. Point is, the TV show is a complete mess, but at the very least, it has freed us of the tiny bit of hope that we might have had that we'll ever see a proper Fallout game in the future. So, at the very least, you can thank Emil for opening his big mouth and saying something really stupid that turned out to actually be very liberating for those of us who actually have cared about Fallout for a long time. Because we can just finally lay the series to rest for good and completely reject everything Bethesda has done that has just completely screwed it up. And as for those of you who might actually be new to Fallout and not really gelling with what Bethesda's been doing, but you find New Vegas and actually enjoy it, maybe give Fallout 1 and 2 a try. Maybe Tactics as well. You'll probably find that if you like New Vegas, but you don't really like Bethesda's stuff, Fallout 1 and 2 will line up much more with what you're expecting. And if you're looking for something newer that's in a similar vein to classic Fallout, well, funnily enough, the game that inspired Fallout in the first place, Wasteland, got 2 sequels, and they're fairly recent. Wasteland 2 and 3, both great games, well worth playing. They're very different from Bethesda's stuff because they're more tactical role-playing games, but they're actual proper role-playing games, and they're great. So definitely check those out, and if you're not entirely sure, I do have reviews of both of them on the channel, so you can take a look at those and see if that helps you out any. But again, I highly recommend both Wasteland 2 and 3, so definitely check those out. Just keep in mind if you decide to try Wasteland 1 as well, that game came out in 1988, so even with the remastered version that came out relatively recently, it's still a really difficult game to get into, so just bear that in mind. There are also quite a few other games out there that were very heavily influenced by the Fallout series, although I haven't really had much of a chance to go through a lot of those yet. For example, stuff like Encased or Underrail are pretty well-known examples of more indie games that are very heavily inspired by Fallout, but since I haven't messed around with them yet, I can't give a recommendation for or against them. So I'll be able to give you an answer on those after I do get a chance to mess around with them. But something else I can definitely recommend if you're a fan of classic Fallout is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura. It would not exist were it not for Fallout. It was made by former Fallout developers, and a lot of what made Fallout 1 and 2 so great is on full display in Arcanum. So if you liked Fallout, definitely check out Arcanum. It may not be post-apocalyptic, but it's a real gem of a game, and if you're not entirely convinced, I do have a review of that as well if you want to give that a watch. But as for Fallout and the subsequent TV show, well, at least it got Bethesda's lead writer to admit what they've been doing to the franchise, even if he did it inadvertently. Thank you all very much for watching and putting up with this long, rambly, ranty mess of a video. I normally don't cover movies or TV shows and tend to stick to games for a reason. That's my wheelhouse, but in this particular case, it's tied in with a game series that I have a long history with and which I'm pretty well known for covering on my channel. So not only did I have this idea poking me in the back of my brain that said, hey, your audience probably expects you to make a video on the Fallout TV series, even if it's just something very brief. But there was also just the continued massacring of the Fallout series that actually at this point feels like a direct insult, even if they're not intending for it to be. And the general reception I've been seeing for the series being so absurdly, obnoxiously positive has just driven me up the wall. So I just had to vent that out of my system so I can actually get back to doing other things without it just continually poking me in the back of my brain. So again, thank you all very much for watching and putting up with the long, rambly mess. After this, it'll be back to covering typical video game content. First thing I need to do is catch up on the review I've been working of for Wrath Aeon of Ruin, which I am hoping to get done this coming week. And then after that, I'm not really sure what I'm going to be working on, so we'll just have to stay tuned for that. But again, thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.